It's a long-running joke that horror franchises just pump out the same movie time and time again, but that's kind of what fans love about them. It's comforting to know what you're going to get, and even if they're working within a formula, filmmakers do throw in surprises and shake things up here and there. The following movies, though, all took that repetition to the extreme, and in either big or small ways, were content to repackage the same tricks time and time again. Now, I just want to stress this doesn't make them bad or anything like that, but it's still fun to point out exactly where they rip themselves off. I'm Josh from WhatCulture.com, and these are 7 horror movie franchises that literally do the same thing repeatedly. Number 7, Annabelle Constant Origin Stories. Annabelle, based on the actual doll that the real-world Ed and Lorraine Warren claimed had been possessed by an evil spirit, was first teased to audiences in the very first Conjuring movie as one of the evilest cursed items the Warrens had located. From that moment, it was clear that a spin-off was on the cards, and the first of many origin stories for Annabelle was released in 2014. This revealed just how the doll became possessed in the first place in the 60s. The film's negative reception, but highly profitable bottom line, encouraged the filmmakers to add to the lore of Annabelle with yet another prequel origin story set in the 1950s, titled Annabelle Creation. This built on the lore of the first film by giving the doll yet another origin story. Finally, a sequel to that film, Annabelle Comes Home, promised to move the story forward with a 70s setting. However, even this couldn't resist filling in the small amount of time before the prelude to the first Conjuring movie, completing the origin story fully. Explaining the origin behind the doll is one thing, and totally good and fine by the way, but making a point of showing audiences 3 different stories of Annabelle getting into the place where it's found in The Conjuring is a little bit overkill. Number 6, the Amityville Horror, the same story over and over again. Also explored over the course of the first Conjuring movie, the Amityville haunting is one of the most infamous horror stories in the world. The starting point is always 1974, when a man murders his family inside his own home, and a series of strange paranormal experiences are reported by the Lutz family that moves into the house afterwards. The story has spawned 9 different Amityville horror books and nearly 30 films that are either based on the story or share the Amityville name. The bulk of these films have been direct-to-video and remakes, of course, but there has been a couple of sequels that take their stories from the book series released prior. The good news for fans of the franchise is that they're going to be more than familiar with the story of this family by the time they get to the end of the series, and the bad news is that it's pretty much all they're going to get from it, as almost every single fact or event from the story is repeated over and over again. Time and time again, the same house is shown to audiences with the same family experiencing the same experiences from the very same spirits. The family dog always dies, spoilers, the church always sends out the same priest to bless the house, and there's always a couple sightings of one of the house's suicide victims for good measure. The problem with a franchise like the Amityville Horror is simply the fact that going off what is essentially the same story that everyone is familiar with by now will always inevitably lead to the same features being repeated over and over again. Number 5, Friday the 13th, Barnyard Finales, Electric Resurrections, and Dream Endings. One of the most infamous slasher franchises in all of history, Friday the 13th burst onto the scene in 1980 as a self-proclaimed shameless rip-off of the cheap slasher formula made famous by John Carpenter's Halloween. And it proved to be a winning move, with the original Friday the 13th becoming a huge hit and spawning a successful franchise. The whodunit mystery of the first film wouldn't really return in any of the other releases. However, there were plenty of other plot devices and themes the writers would use as crutches throughout the franchise's runtime. Both Friday the 13th Parts 3 and 5 finish up in a large barnyard, Parts 1 and 3, and the remake, in a way, feature dream sequences of both Jason and Pamela Voorhees once the film's final girls make it out onto Crystal Lake on a small rowboat, and the masked killer is brought back to life via electric shocks twice across the series in Parts 6 and 7. Now, Friday the 13th isn't really chained to any real-world restraints, taking Jason into space and turning him into an immortal zombie by Part 6. However, it's still amazing how similar the tropes and traits of each film can feel whenever someone sits down and actually makes their way through all of them. Number 4, Resident Evil, unresolved cliffhangers, unexplained character disappearances, and taking away Alice's powers. I've mentioned in previous videos how much of a genuine fan I am of the often terrible Resident Evil movies, and part of that weird love is because it constantly makes the same dumb mistakes. Take how it always discards a cliffhanger. The second movie is the only film to properly follow up on the promise of a previous movie's cliffhanger. pieties, while the rest of the movies treat it as an annoying obligation to get out of the way or not even mention at all. Take for instance the end of the second movie, where main character Alice is broken out of confinement with Jill and Carlos, then activated by Umbrella. Come the start of the third film though, and Alice is on her own, Jill is nowhere to be seen, and the world has turned into a desert. The end of the third film sees Alice with an army of clones, which are then swiftly all killed off at the start of the fourth movie. The fourth movie ends with a brainwashed Jill and an army attacking our heroes, which is resolved in a montage in the opening of the fifth movie. The fifth movie ends with a last stand with former enemies and allies on top of the White House, a battle which is then skipped over at the start of the sixth movie, and in between, major characters both died and switched alliances off screen. And also now the world's a desert again. I don't know what's going on. This is all on top of characters just disappearing for movies at a time as well. I mean, what happened to Jill? What happened to Claire? What happened to Chris? I don't even think Chris is mentioned again. The movie loves giving and taking away Alice's powers as well, to the point where she flip-flops between movies and inside those movies. Just pick one. Number 3, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre Grandpa's Dinner Scene. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre series is built around repeated scenes and stories, but it's interesting because while some of this is clearly uninventive franchise box ticking, the repetition is sometimes intentional to add extra dimensions to the story. There are a lot of examples, but the one sequence that always pops up is the dinner scene with Leatherface and his family, as they torment some poor soul. You know the drill. The victim wakes up at a dinner table, the old, barely alive grandpa is wheeled out, and someone is going to get pitifully whacked in the head with a hammer. It was iconic in the original, and the second film features a near identical sequence. Again, this is intentional though, as Texas Chainsaw 2 is almost a parody of the original film by the same director, who recycled the beats but cranked them to exaggerated, ridiculous levels. Texas Chainsaw 3 changes the Sawyer family around, but the old geezer still somehow turns up again to put in a similar shift, though admittedly this one is the most different to the others. It's the fourth flick, the much maligned Next Generation, that brings it back in a big way though. The grandpa is back again, because at this point I guess it's presumably not a party without him, and the extended sequence is more gruesome than ever, and visually and structurally the closest to the original flick. Again though, this was intentional, as it was supposed to imply that the family had essentially been sticking to the same script to terrorize people with by a shady cult-like group. The series has always played fast and loose with continuity, but it is pretty funny how each movie basically remakes the first in their own unique ways. Number 2, Final Destination, the same character archetypes and same death rules. Now, like so many of the franchises on this list, I love the Final Destination series. I grew up on it, would recommend it to all horror fans, and it holds a real place in my heart. That said though, while all horror franchises do repeat the same general premise often, Final Destination has such a specific story formula that it repeats every single movie. If you're unaware, these flicks are all about people avoiding deadly disasters, but then paying for it as death hunts them down one by one for escaping its list. Consequently, each movie concerns people attempting to cheat death in various different ways. The thing is, by the third movie, the audience already understands these rules, so we have to spend time watching the characters figure out how to skip death and try and mostly fail to figure out how to eventually cheat it for good. Outside of the second movie though, none of these attempts to cheat death actually work for the characters. In fact, the movie conveniently forgets the ending of 2 so it can go back and stick to the formula. And don't get me wrong, it is a good formula, and the inevitable deaths are great, but there is something deflating knowing that despite their efforts, all the characters will end up dead, even in the fifth film, that for a while looked like it was really going to shake up the formula properly. Each entry into the Final Destination franchise also has a set of character traits that range from someone not believing in what has happened and who laughs off these subsequent developments, to those who immediately begin spouting off about spiritual and religious conspiracy theories, to those who are able to follow a breadcrumb trail and work out the connections between what is unfolding. All of the characters work, but combined with them showing up all the time and the fact that they're always relearning the same rules that we already know, it can't help but feel like we've done this dance before. Number 1, Saw. Always returning to the same trap ideas. There's 2 sides to each Saw movie. First, there's the group of characters actually placed in a trap, and then there's the detective melodrama story of the people trying to hunt down John Kramer and his apprentices. For the most part, the latter half of this equation is always kept fresh fresh, and its many twists, developments, and retcons were what kept fans interested in the long haul. It's the story about the traps themselves that often falls into formula though, with these same scenarios and traps themselves being repeated. One of the biggest offenders comes in the teamwork movies. Here, the idea is that a group of volatile people are put together to get through a series of traps, usually with one person dying in each room. The inevitable twist is that, oh shucks, they should have been working together the whole time and they all would have survived and lived happily ever after. Alright, maybe not happily ever after, but they would have lived. Not only is this fact way too easy to discern, yet the characters can rarely ever see it themselves, but it's a gotcha moment that never quite worked whether it was in Saw 5, Jigsaw, or Saw 2. Even the traps and tools Jigsaw employs end up repeating themselves over the course of the franchise. There are 3 separate people, Amanda, Hoffman, and Jill, who end up having a bear trap placed on them in the first 7 films, and the bathroom from the first film ends up being revisited in Saws 2, 3, 4, and 3D, for example. The reason why victims are killed is often repeated too, with the killing of corrupt police officers turning up in Spiral, Jigsaw, Saw 2, and Saw 3D. Again, I want to stress that this isn't a bad thing per se. I love Saw as much as everyone else, and of course I pop every single time that bathroom door is opened, but still, it's a bag of tricks nonetheless. So that's our list. I want to know what you guys think down in the comments below. Have you noticed any similarities between franchises like this that I missed off here? And are there any from these franchises that I forgot to talk about here as well? While you're down there as well, could you give us a like, share, subscribe, and head over to What Culture Horror for more lists like this on the regular. Even if you don't though, I've been Josh, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you soon.